Commissioner, I'll start off with looking at knife crime. A jury at Maidstone Crown Court today is deliberating in relation to a tragic death in my constituency, Carl Yule, a 17-year-old who was stabbed by other teenagers. And one of the most difficult things a Member of Parliament, anyone has to do, is then to sit with the relatives, and in this case the mother of the young teenager, and who wants justice for their child, but also who wants to ensure that everything that can be done is being done to ensure that this doesn't happen to others. In relation to Medway and my constituency in Gillingham and Rainham, that area has never historically had a gang crime. We are very in close proximity to London. Transport links are very speedy now, with high speed and other connectivity. And a lot of what happens in London affects areas like Medway, and I think one of your colleagues mentioned areas in Manchester, if there's incidents there, will then be other neighbouring areas will be affected in close proximity. Can you just clarify and confirm the collaboration that you have with Kent Police, which has been rated outstanding on three inspections now, that everything that can be done is being done to ensure that the problems that are coming in from London are being effectively dealt with in that joint collaboration?
So I join you in saying, abhorring the murder and the murders, and secondly, it's an awful thing and something that I also, I'm a professional police officer, so I may have had to do more of it over a longer period, but over the last few months I have met many mothers and many grieving families and been to funerals, and I completely see that people want to know, on the first hand, justice please, on the second hand, usually, I mean, different people, different of course, but usually, what are you doing? We must all stop people carrying knives, we must protect our young people, is the next sort of thing they want. And we do work very closely with, in your example, Kent Police. And as Lynn has said earlier, where we are talking about county lines, which it may or may not be in the Medway instance, there is a huge amount of burgeoning kind of coordination going on. I will undertake to go back and have another look at how our cross-border, because it is cross-border working with Kent. I should do that. But we have, they come to what we call our various tasking meetings. We have joint meetings on all sorts of things that we will have in common, like travelling burglars and that kind of thing. And in particular, we are sharing our learning and our intelligence in relation to knife crime and drug dealing, where we know it is affecting other parts of the country, including particularly Kent.
Well, Commissioner, can I just say, I have no doubt at all about your commitment and your passion to do everything you can on this issue, and I'm grateful for that, and the officers that you have, and you now have in your remit one of my former area commanders in Medway working for the Met, so I know you have some brilliant officers doing everything they can on this. Can I just move over to the issue of counter-terrorism, if I may? We heard earlier about the point about resources and funding. Would I be right in saying, and just looking at the statement yesterday by the Home Secretary, that in 2015 spending review, 2 billion a year was allocated to policing to deal with counter-terrorism, and linked to that, this year, a further 15 million has been given to terrorism policing, and due to go up to £750 million. Just to get that into context, is that comments made by the Home Secretary yesterday on funding accurate?
I certainly recognise the second two, and I have no reason to doubt the first, assuming the Home Secretary said that then. But I don't have that right at my fingertips. I can check, of course, but I'm sure that will be right. And
just linked to that, having read the speech given by Mr. Parker, the MI5 Director General in Berlin, he said 12 further terrorist attacks were thwarted since the tragic incidents and horrific incidents that we saw in 2017. And just for clarification, with an eye on Brexit, some say there may be issues about intelligence sharing once we leave Brexit. For clarity, are you able to share the information that those 12 incidents that were thwarted, was that in relation to intelligence from within the United Kingdom, or was that in relation to intelligence by our counterparts in the Middle East, or whether it's with the United States, or whether it's from Europe, or whether it's for counterparts, I'm a trade envoy for Pakistan, or whether it's from Pakistan? Are you able to just clarify, if you are in a position to say those 12 incidents that are thwarted, were in relation to our own intelligence or intelligence by other countries.
So I think if you look at the 5 ghastly attacks, you will have seen, and Andrew talks about this, the sheer variety of history, background, and sort of manifestation, and indeed to some extent tactics used. And that is what we are now dealing with. And within the 12, there is a huge variety as well. We rely on a daily basis on intelligence sharing and operational work together and learning with all sorts of countries around the world. Of course, most particularly the United States of America. And I have, 50-odd officers working in other countries around the world. I can't tell you, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate for me since some of them are still coming to court, and even then it might not be, where precisely the original, if there was such a thing, intelligence comes from. Some, of course, relate to people who are, entirely British born and bred, radicalised, perhaps online, and affected by other British people. But others undoubtedly have links with various parts of the world. And we work very, very closely with our colleagues in various or all actually of the European Union countries. And
just linked to that, and I totally get the point that you can't comment on the 12 whether it was from within, intelligence from within or elsewhere, because those are matters which are currently being looked at, but grateful that it is intelligence sharing around the world which helps keep our country safe. The next point which Mr. Parker went on to say is that the increase in threat is linked to an upshift in Daesh's murderous ideology. And so in relation to what we're doing as a country to help address that challenge of individuals being sucked in to that poison ideology. We've had around 800 who went to Syria and Iraq to fight with Daesh, and the threat that is immense. So although Daesh may be militarily defeated, but you have to defeat the idea, the ideology and the appeal. What are we doing on that?
You do, and I think Andrew talked and always talks about the sort of threat from home, overseas and online, and we have to work in all the arenas. And of course it's not just the police or indeed just the police and MI5, despite the fact that we probably have, as I say, great skill, resource and abilities and the best working relationship of any in the world. A lot of the work on, if you like, the counter-narrative and the things which might pull somebody into understanding and believing and liking that ideology are really not to do with the police at all. They're better done by other people, whether that is in terms of foreign policy sometimes or in terms of education and universities and discussions there. But this is a part of the Prevent programmes, which of course is part of Contest, as we've said, and has been given an extra boost yesterday. It's vitally important, and I think that's why the Home Secretary and indeed Andrew would say, this isn't just about people fighting and coming back and skilled at all. It's about the ideology, and therefore that's why we say probably this tempo of work, which is very high for our people, in keeping the public safe, will continue for at least 2 years. And
just clarification on that, you had a brilliant former assistant Commissioner, Mr. Rowley, who dealt with counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, and he said that is often members of the individual's own community which help identify individuals subject to radicalisation and extremism, and it's communities on the front line which help defeat extremism. He was absolutely right then, and he's absolutely, I think those words are absolutely right now. Just coming on to that in terms of Prevent, and you said about revamping Prevent. And I know, when Prevent came into play before we had the problem with Daesh. Daesh came after that. So in terms of Prevent and revamping, how are you going to do it to address that new challenge?
So the first point is communities defeat terrorism is actually a phrase even from actually further back in terms of the threat we used to be dealing with in terms of Republican Irish terrorism. It is absolutely true. We completely believe that, all of us, and we have seen, I believe, a considerable change. I've been involved in this since 2001. I've seen a considerable change in our communities in terms of people's desire to assist, the information we get, the volume, the type, the people tipping us off, mothers sometimes telling us, I'm worried about Fred, or even Fred looks to me to be on the way to go and do something. And we have to keep working at that. And that is about much more than just prevent, actually. That's about, for example, in policing terms, as we've said, about having good local relationships, about having good community engagement, people understanding who we are, what we stand for, that we can be trusted, and we know how to get information from the streets of Bexley Heath into Thames House and potentially overseas, properly and carefully and quickly. Prevent is, as I say, just a part of it, but prevent itself has had some fantastic results, including in the post-Daesh era, and absolutely recognises the pernicious ideology, I don't want to use that word, the extraordinary communication ability that Daesh has used. They are consummate communicators, as horrible, terrifying terrorist groups go, compared with any that we've been working against. And so we do need to recognise that and work with others, including, of course, the internet companies and the tech companies, to deal with it.
Look, can I just say that I've got nephews who are 17, 15 and 9, and I don't want them to be sucked in, because anyone can be sucked into this poison narrative. And I think what Prevent does, and what it's set up to do, I fully support. But the point I say when you talk about revamping, when you speak to communities, is that considering it's an ongoing model, that the concerns that communities may have is to take them into account, because you've got to build trust and confidence. And therefore, that as this goes on, that where those concerns are. And half the problem that we have is we don't explain to communities how it works. And therefore, it's about engaging and listening, because we all want to do the same thing, about keeping our children and our country safe. And this, I think, goes a long way in that. Just a couple more questions on this before I move on finally. The 3,000 individuals are of interest to the police in relation to extremism, and around 3,000. Are you able to say, because the threat that we have from extremism is some is Daesh, some is Al-Qaeda inspired, and some is via far-right extremism. Are you able to say what percentage is what in relation to that 3,000, the numbers of interest that you have?
So the 3,000, or as you say, thereabouts, figure comes from the security service. I think it was the security minister who said it, but it's the security service figure, and that does relate to the non-far right threat, as I understand it. I cannot give you the exact numbers. What I can tell you is that, as well as the 12 plots that were disrupted that the security service talk about, we also, of course, last year disrupted 4 extreme right-wing threats. And although the nature of the threat and the scale of the threat is very, very different, it is something we take extremely seriously, and you will be aware that during the time this committee has been sitting in this format, there's been prescription of a far-right group, and indeed of extreme right-wing group, and indeed we have some arrests made and trials coming forward in relation to extreme right-wing at the moment, which are going to be very high-profile, I'm sure. And this is something we take extremely seriously. I can't, and probably wouldn't, divide out between Daesh and Al-Qaeda. I think it's a bit more complicated than that anyway. And then secondly, the extreme right-wing volumes is not something we would normally talk about in terms of the numbers of individuals.
But it's important. The reason I say that, and I totally get what you say, is that people out there can understand the problem that we have with extremism is with all forms of extremism, far right and those inspired with Daesh or Al-Qaeda. If I may go to Ms. Thornton, just a question on your point about data transfer and the issue with data and the police. I used to prosecute cases and defend cases before. One thing which any civil society should be proud of is about administration of justice. And we've seen many cases come to court where individuals have been acquitted or cases have been thrown out before, where officers have not disclosed data which has led to the undermining of the trial. And nowadays, when you're looking at rape cases and allegations, there's a lot of stuff on one's mobile phones which needs to be looked at. Some is unused material, but some quite clearly is not being disclosed, which need to be disclosed, or the officers are not looking at it the way they need to be looking at it. The issue with that, and taking into account what has happened, and it's all in the public domain, is that down to the fact the officers do not understand disclosure? Is it down to incompetence, or is it down to the fact you don't have sufficient resources?
So let me start by saying the issues of disclosure and the threat that poses to the criminal justice system is something that none of us underestimate at all. As you'll be aware, the issue of disclosure, going back to the common law and then the Criminal Procedures and Investigation Act 1996, it has always been difficult. And in fact, new arrangements were made in about 2011, I think, for organised crime, for counter-terrorism, for fraud cases, because those were the cases where traditionally there was a massive volume, not just of evidence, as you say, but of unused material that had been gathered over the course of the investigation. What, of course, has happened in the last 5-10 years is particularly for rapes and serious sexual offences, the amount of data has grown exponentially because of all the digital material that we all have. And of course, particularly if the complainant and the offender are known to each other, there'll be a huge amount of material. So we take it very seriously. We have been working since the inspection report last year with the Crown Prosecution Service on improving practice, and we jointly published an improvement plan in January of this year. There are a whole range of different things we're doing, including some new College of Policing training, dedicated specific training on disclosure. It tended to be in a detective constable's course or a detective sergeant's course. We've now got bespoke training. We've also been speaking to and commissioning work on technology, because although with the Court of Appeal, I think, said in 2015 that it's quite all right, quite appropriate to use search terms, but actually we think that we could go beyond using search terms, more advanced searches, machine learning, to look for this material, because actually if you're talking about sexual offences, it's quite tricky to know what search terms you're looking for if the issue is one of consent. But I think, so a whole range of practical things. What are the things that we have piloted, primarily with the CPS, but officers dealing with this is for all rape and sexual offences cases, is what we call a disclosure management document. So at the beginning say, what do we think the defence case is? And then what have we done in terms of inquiring into people's use of social media platforms, what's on their phone, what might be on the cloud, what searches have we done, what have we looked at? And of course these documents are quite extensive. If that is done properly with the investigating officer, then there's a much better earlier discussion with the prosecutor about what material might be relevant in the light of the defence statement. So there are particular practical things which actually have been used for serious cases for quite a few years, but we're now bringing into rape and serious sexual assault. But the other issue, so one about skills, one is about systems and process. I think another is about mindset. My colleague, the Chief of Surrey, is on record and saying that sometimes disclosure was seen as something you did at the end of the investigation as an administrative task. Actually, it's got to be in the mindset of the investigator from the word go. And that requirement that we have to record, retain and reveal needs to be front and centre. So there's a whole range of activity going on, and I assure you none of us take it seriously.
It's an ongoing process.
Well, it's okay. So
trying to be as thorough as I can.
Okay. So in order to do this properly in the short term, forces have had to move more investigators into these areas. And I mentioned earlier, I was looking at the figures for sexual offences receipts in the courts and in Crown Court workload in general. And if you look over the last 18 months to 2 years, those numbers are going down. Now, what I don't know is it because there's so many cases caught in the system because they're just taking much longer, or is it because different decisions are being taken about whether to indict or not? But I think there is cause for concern. It is resource intensive. We are shifting people, but I also I am concerned about how many cases might be caught in the system.
Commissioner.
I would just want to say these are good people doing their best in very difficult circumstances. None of us had a mobile phone when the CPIA came in, the Relevant Act. We see a doubling of data that we have to deal with every 18 months. It's partly because we're examining so many more devices. As Sarah says, that is partly because of lifestyle changes, but also because we're dealing with a greater proportion of offences in which, in particular, the relationship is such a crucial thing. And the volumes, I know you know this, sir, but they are utterly staggering. You know, so not a relationship thing necessarily, but in a counter-terrorist investigation, we take now 10 terabytes of data, could be 30. So that's, the British Library has 150 million items in it. That's 32 terabytes. So that's just to kind of give the picture of the volume. And our people are genuinely doing their best, and I think they are struggling with our serious crime teams, our homicide teams, our fraud teams deal with sometimes very high volume and are mostly able to do it in terms of both their resourcing and their skills very well. And I know the Director of Public Prosecutions is giving evidence at a different committee today, and she will probably say that. Where we are struggling to some extent in the Met has been with, as I said, the sort of Crown Court daily business of rape, serious sexual offences, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, human trafficking, slavery, where the relationship is absolutely crucial. But I know the Met have been absolutely in the eye of the storm of this. We've taken it very seriously, as Sarah has said. We've had to move resources in to do the reviews and make sure that all our sexual offences cases are trial ready and properly, the disclosure is correct, and that will continue.
And just final point on that, I'm trying to be as fair as one can. In relation to the resources that you say, the pressure on resources, working with the Director of Public Prosecutions, how much extra resources do you need in relation to this? Because at the end of the day, a false allegation destroys lives, a conviction destroys lives, and you want to make sure pinnacle of any society is that individuals get justice. And therefore, when looking at resources and ensuring justice is done, then everything can be done and should be done to find those resources to ensure that justice is done and you get the resources. So I know it's just asking off the hoof, but if you can afterwards, if you can't do it now, write to the committee and say what are the resources that you need to help address this. We'd be very grateful.
So all I can say at this point, and we'll try and put something together in writing for you, is that all chiefs have had to make different decisions to make sure this work is being done properly in line with the action plan that we talked about. I haven't got any national figures. We'll see what we can do. Of course, one of the problems is that this is happening on top of the fact chiefs reported to the inspectorate earlier this year that we are 17% down on the number of detectives we'd like in an ideal world.
Right.
So we're actually trying to push resources into an area where we're already short, but we'll see what we can do in terms of numbers.
Sure. Can I just give one very short answer?
Yes, of course.
What was thought to be a reasonably straightforward case, you will again be familiar with this, but at a moment in the trial there was a question about what's on the Facebook account. We called in 18 officers who did 200 hours work over that weekend. Now that's not unusual, just to be able to and that it was by no failing of the police or the prosecution at all. It was something the witness said that made the judge think we better. That's just an example.
Sure.
And Lynn could give countless of the sheer hours. We'd be happy to follow up, I'm sure, that in the particular types of cases we're talking about, that is now going into achieving what you say, which is obviously no innocent person must be convicted through a failure of disclosure.